But thank you all so much for joining us for the mysteries of the Irish Hellfire Club. One of the United Kingdom's leading paranormal investigators, Steve Parsons, will discuss the mysteries of the Irish Hellfire Club. Ireland, the home of Halloween, is also the location of the Hellfire Club. Situated just outside of Dublin, the Hellfire Club was a place of sacrifice, ritual, and mayhem. Members of the infamous club were the elite of British and Irish society who feared no one, until one stormy night a stranger arrived to play a hand of cards. 150 miles away on Ireland's rugged south coast lies the most haunted house in Ireland, home to the wealthy Loftus family. Here, another fateful game of cards took place. But how are these two events connected, and is there a connection to present day? So Steve's going to tell us all about it tonight. And so the Wall Street Journal has called Steve Parsons the gold standard in ghost hunting. He spent more than 30 years as a full-time investigator of ghosts, poltergeists, haunted houses, and related phenomena. He is acknowledged by his peers and leading academic parapsychologists to be one of the best investigators in the United Kingdom. He's the author of two highly regarded books, Ghostology, The Art of Ghost Hunting, and Paracoustics, Sound and the Paranormal. His prolific work has been featured on or been cited in many books, journals, magazines, and newspapers. He has starred in and contributed to many TV documentaries, including appearances on the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, and the BBC. He has worked as an investigator and presenter on hit TV ghost hunting shows, including Most Haunted and I'm Famous and Frightened. All right. Whew. Well, with all that, all 70 of us or so who are watching live and the many more that will watch the recording, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Steve for joining us tonight. And Steve, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
That's a hard introduction to follow, Robert. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And it's been my great pleasure to be here and to talk about one of my favorite subjects. I live on the far west coast of the British mainland in the country of Wales, and just a short hop away, 35 miles away across the Irish Sea, is the Emerald Isle, Ireland, and a place that I spend a lot of my time. Dublin is actually my nearest capital city, and I've had the great pleasure to spend a lot of time in Ireland and have a great number of friends there. What I will have to do, unfortunately, because I do live so far west in I was going to say the middle of nowhere, but it's the edge of nowhere, is to turn off my camera during this presentation in order to save bandwidth. So I'll do that straight away if I can find the right settings. Now, I can't promise that this presentation won't be without the occasional technical hitch when I press the wrong button or cue the wrong slide. It is just after midnight here in the UK, and today was my wife's degree graduation, so we were up very early, and we've driven about 300 miles during the day. But nonetheless, you can see the title on the screen, When the Devil Played Cards, and Robert has already given you the introduction. And I chose the subject because Ireland is a favourite location of mine, and as we draw closer to Halloween, we remember that Ireland is the home of Halloween. It's also the home of the Hellfire Club. This was a short-lived club. Some would say fortunately short-lived, because it was a place of sacrifice, ritual, murder, mayhem. And the members of this club, they were the elite of British and Irish society. They feared no man until one stormy night, a stranger arrived to play a hand of cards. Just south of Dublin stands or lies Mount Pellier, or Montpellier Hill, has several names. Close to the summit stands an abandoned building known by everyone as the Hellfire Club. Today, the empty and dilapidated building stares down onto the city of Dublin almost 1,300 feet below, and it has become a place where visitors fear to linger by day or even visit at all after dark. On the site where the Hellfire Club now stands, there was originally a Neolithic passage tomb dating back almost 6,000 years. The tomb was constructed within a circle of large boulders known as a cairn. In 1725, William Connolly, at the time the Speaker of the Irish Parliament and one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Ireland, ordered the building of the house on the site in order to serve as a hunting lodge for himself and for his guests. He chose the site close to the summit of Mount Pellier Hill for the commanding views it provided in every direction. To facilitate the building of his new hunting lodge, Connolly ordered that the ancient burial chamber be destroyed and used many of the original stones in the construction of his new hunting lodge. Shortly after the building was completed, the slated roof was blown off in a great storm, and locals were quick to attribute this misfortune to the work of the devil as a revenge for the destruction of the ancient cairn. Although Connolly quickly had the roof replaced with a stronger arched roof made from solid stone, the lodge became known locally as a place of bad fortune and of evil. The original hunting lodge consisted of 2 large rooms and a hall on the upper floor. On the ground level was a large kitchen quarters and rooms for the servants and a number of small ante-rooms. All the windows faced north and provided those who were staying at the lodge with magnificent views of Dublin. After Connolly's death in 1729, the building became unoccupied and was left empty for a number of years until it was acquired by members of the infamous Dublin Hellfire Club, from where it gains its later name. Hellfire clubs were established in several British cities during the 18th century. They were frequented by the wealthy and by the elite of society, and quickly became associated with outrageous behaviour, drunkenness, debauchery, and depravity. The president of each Hellfire Club was usually called the King of Hell, and would ceremonially dress like Satan, complete with horns, wings, and shoes that resembled cloven hoofs. It was a common custom at Hellfire meetings to leave the vice president's chair unoccupied as a seat for the devil, in whose honour the first toast was always drunk. The first Earl of Ross established an Irish Hellfire Club in Dublin in 1735. The family was originally an English family who had been granted land and settled in Ireland in the 1590s during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. Following their arrival in Ireland, the family originally settled in County Wexford at the town of New Ross, before gaining further estates across the country, including their present family home at Birr Castle in County Offaly. The first Earl was the son of Richard, the first Viscount Ross, and of Elizabeth Hamilton, the niece of the Duchess of Marlborough. He also held several other titles, including the second Viscount Ross of Ballamont and Baron Oxmantown. The town of New Ross is perhaps most famous today for being the original birthplace of the Kennedy family, and today this link is commemorated by the JFK or John F. Kennedy Memorial Arboretum and Museum. New Ross was also a key embarkation point for many Irish families escaping to the New World during the Great Potato Famine in the 1840s. A replica ship, the Dunbrody, and a museum now commemorate both the tragedy of the famine and the epic journey of the countless Irish migrants who left on a journey to establish new lives for themselves and for their descendants in America. But this isn't a travel log. So let's return to our tale of the Earl of Ross and the Hellfire Club. In addition to founding the Hellfire Club, the Earl was a notable Freemason and served several terms as the Grand Master of the Irish Freemasonry Lodge. During a trip to Egypt, the Earl claimed to have found ancient scrolls that had been looted from the Great Library of Alexandria, and upon his return, he wrote a book entitled Dionysus Rising. He also founded the sacred sect of Dionysus. Dionysus was the Greek god of winemaking and of festivities and ritual madness. Dionysus, perhaps better known as with his Roman name as Bacchus, is also linked to the great bacchanalian orgies that were held by the Roman elite. Incidentally, a remnant of the sacred sect of Dionysus still exists today, based down in New Orleans, and is called the Revived Order of Dionysus. It is an offshoot of mainstream Freemasonry, inspired by the Earl's book, of which only 2 copies are known to exist. On a dark and stormy night, members of the Dublin Hellfire Club were drinking and playing cards when the door burst open and a mysterious stranger entered, seeking shelter from the raging storm. As the lightning flashed, the assembled members invited their unexpected guest to join them in a hand or 2 of cards. The stranger was handsome and charming and a perfect guest. As the storm continued, the players continued to drink and to wager their bets. However, at some point during the game, one of the players dropped a card and bent to retrieve it from where it had fallen beneath the table. To his horror, he noticed that their visitor had cloven hooves instead of booted feet. The terrified man screamed aloud, shouting out that the devil was amongst them. At once, with the rest of the players alerted, the stranger leapt up from his chair, and with a thunderous sound like that of a cannon being fired, he shot upwards and out through the ceiling and the roof of the building. Only a sulphurous smell of brimstone lingered in the air, and the sound of fading thunder echoed across the dark night. The assembled members, transfixed in fear, and by now each was stone cold sober. As the story of the events that night spread, the Hellfire Club's reputation as a place of evil increased. People claimed that the meetings were no longer a place for drinking and gambling, but were being used for the practice of Satanism and other occult activities. Locals believed that the devil continued to regularly visit the meetings to play cards with the members, and it was said that an inverted bell was used in the rituals in order to summon the devil when it was time for him to come and join the members. This tale may actually be one of the origins or an origin of the exclamation Hell's Bells. There is another story connected to the Hellfire Club that mentions a devout priest who arrived unannounced at the club late one night after hearing of the devil's visits. The priest intended to confront and to exorcise Satan as he and the members drank and played cards. According to the story, the poor priest was quickly overpowered, tied to a chair and forced to watch while the group performed their vile rituals and engaged in worshipping a huge black cat. Breaking free from his captors, the priest grabbed the cat and held it tightly as he uttered a prayer of exorcism. As the priest completed the prayer, the cat's body was torn apart and a demon shot from its corpse. Hurtling through the roof, the demon caused the stone ceiling to shatter and fall upon those present. killing the priest and mortally wounding several of the club's members. Late in the 1700s, the club was indeed severely damaged by a serious fire. In the finest Irish tradition, there are, of course, several stories connected with this incident. One holds that members of the Hellfire Club set fire to the building when William Connolly's son refused to renew their lease and gave notice for the club to leave. Another story recounts that following a black mass, a footman to one of the members accidentally spilled a drink onto another member's coat. The enraged man retaliated by pouring brandy over the poor servant and setting him alight. As the servant ran around in a panic and terror, with his clothes burning, it caused the fire to spread, setting the whole building alight, killing many of the Hellfire Club members and several of their servants. Now, these stories might just be that, but it is a fact that the building was severely damaged following a fire, after which the Hellfire Club meetings were relocated further down the hill to Killikey House. Killikey House, or to use its original name, the Steward's House, was built around 1765 by members of the Connolly family. Over the years, the building has served as a dower house and also as a residence for the land agent who managed the Killikey estate. At the rear of the building is a bell tower, which was once a common feature of Irish farms, used to call the estate workers for their meals. Following the relocation of the Hellfire Club to Killikey House, it too quickly gained a reputation for harbouring evil and being a place of wickedness. In more recent years, the house has also gained a reputation for being haunted, particularly by a large and malevolent black cat. The story of the spectral cat was even marked by the restaurant sign outside of Killikey House, although they did choose a less menacing kitty to promote their business. Stories regarding the origin of this feline spectre either connect it with the story of the priest who exorcised the cat at the original Hellfire Club building, or to a helpless pet cat that was doused in whiskey and set alight by members of the Hellfire Club before it fled in terror out across Mount Pellier Hill with its fur ablaze. Perhaps the most or best documented account of the hauntings of Killikey occurred between 1968 and 1970. The Irish Evening Herald and Evening Press newspapers both carried a number of reports regarding a Mrs. Margaret O'Brien and her husband Nicholas, who was a retired police superintendent. They had bought the property and they were in the process of converting it into a home and an arts centre. The redevelopment work had been troubled almost from the very beginning, with the tradesmen who were employed on the work leaving or refusing to return, complaining that they had seen ghosts and had experienced strange and unnerving events. One evening, a friend of the O'Briens, the artist Tom McCasey, and two workmen who were engaged in the renovations were confronted by a wicked-looking black cat with glowing red eyes that seemed to be furtively watching them and following them from room to room. Later, when they told the O'Briens about the cat, they were informed that they didn't have a cat, but said that they too had seen this strange cat, although all attempts to catch it had failed, and that on each occasion the cat had simply disappeared. Shortly after his encounter, McCasey painted a portrait of the cat, which hung in the house for several years. The cat itself also continued to appear menacingly, staring at the family and their visitors before vanishing. Other apparitions were reported, including a shadowy figure, and there were regular reports of ringing bells and of poltergeist activity, with objects moving, being thrown about, or disappearing entirely. In 1971, a plumber working in the house lifted the floor and discovered a grave beneath it. The shallow grave contained a small skeleton, most likely that of a child, or perhaps the body of a dwarf who was alleged to have been sacrificed almost 2 centuries earlier by members of the Hellfire Club. Together with the body, the grave also contained a small brass or bronze figurine of a horned devil or demon with a long tail. The figure was posed thumbing its nose as if by way of an insult. In the years that followed, the house has operated as a centre for arts and later, in the 1990s, as a restaurant before it finally closed its doors to the public in 2001. It is now a private residence. The present owners seem contented, and they are unwilling to say if the spectral cat or any of the other ghosts still haunt Killikey House. It's time now for us to leave Dublin and its Hellfire Club behind, and we're going to head to the far southwest of Ireland to continue our story. The desolate Hook Peninsula juts out several miles into the Atlantic. At its tip stands the 800-year-old Hook Lighthouse. Almost 6 miles away across the estuary of the Barrow River stands Crook Point Lighthouse. These 2 beacons mark the entrance to the port of New Ross. Sailors navigating their way into the harbour became familiar with the route, and the saying, by hook or by crook, was brought to be. Just a mile or so further up the Hook Peninsula stands Loftus Hall, a building that is described and promoted by its present owner as being the most haunted house in Ireland. Originally called Redmond Hall, or Redmond Castle, parts of the present-day hall date to the 12th century castle that was built by Sir Alexander Redmond. In 1650, the Redmond family found themselves on the losing side during the Irish Confederate Wars and were forced to relinquish the hall and move away. Following their departure, ownership passed to the Loftus family, who renamed the building Loftus Hall. Like the Earls of Ross, the Loftus family were also originally an English family who had been granted land and who had settled in Ireland during the reign of Elizabeth I. The Loftus family and the Earls family were well acquainted, and it is likely that members of both families were also connected by marriage. In 1642, during the Irish Confederate Wars, soldiers of King Charles I, stationed at the nearby garrison at Duncannon Fort, attacked the hall. Just 10 gallant Irish defenders, under the command of Alexander Redmond, held off a much stronger force of Royalist troops until the Irish relief force arrived. Many of the English troops were killed or captured, and the following day, many more were executed by hanging by Redmond and his Irish followers. Duncannon Fort also still stands today at the gateway to the Hook Peninsula and is itself a location for many well-attested ghosts and of other strange happenings. Unfortunately, the need for expensive renovation work has meant that the fort has been closed to members of the public now for several years. During 1766, while the Loftus family were living abroad, the Tottenham family, consisting of Charles, his wife, and their teenage daughter Anne, took up temporary residence at Loftus Hall. The Hook Peninsula. Even I forgot about that one. The Hook Peninsula lies exposed to many violent storms that sweep in from the Atlantic. And on one particular wild and stormy night, a ship was seen sheltering in the bay below the hall, and a member of the crew rowed ashore seeking refuge and perhaps a warm meal at Loftus Hall. The handsome young man who knocked on the door of Loftus seeking shelter was tall and well dressed, and quickly young Anne Tottenham found herself attracted to him. He was charming, and his conversation was witty and lively, full of tales of faraway exotic places. Outside, the storm grew in intensity, preventing the man from returning to his ship. The family offered him food and lodging until the storm abated, and for several days the storm raged, and as the days passed, the bond between Anne Tottenham and the handsome sailor grew stronger. They would sit together for hours, sometimes until late into the night, as he enthralled her with more of his stories. One evening, the family and their guest assembled to play a game of cards. You have to remember, this was the days before Netflix and video box sets, so card games were a popular pastime. And after several hands of cards, Anne dropped one of her cards, which fell to the floor. The butler started forward to retrieve the card, but Anne had already bent beneath the table, reaching for the dropped card. As she looked for the card, she noticed that instead of boots, the handsome young man had cloven feet. She shouted out in shock and surprise. At this, the handsome young man leapt up and in a flash shot upwards through the ceiling, through the upper floor, and finally out through the roof, leaving behind a huge hole and a lingering smell of brimstone. The terrified family withdrew to their chamber, leaving their servants to their fate. The following morning, the storm had abated, and the ship, it was gone. Anne was overcome with a strange longing, and she spent her days and her nights gazing out across the estuary, watching for the ship, hoping her handsome young man would return. Whenever storms rolled across Hook Head and rattled the windows of Loftus Hall, she would stand at the windows, staring into the gloom, forlornly watching the waves crash onto the shore. In time, Anne began to refuse to leave her room, and also began refusing food, all the while constantly staring at the sea and looking for the ship and her handsome young man with the cloven feet. Anne Tottenham died in 1775, starved and driven mad by her self-imposed confinement and her longing. This often told story states that the hole in the ceiling of the room in which the card game took place, and where the handsome young man shot upwards, skywards, can never be properly repaired, and the damage can be seen to this day in the ceiling of the tapestry room. Many of the locals still believe that the stranger with the cloven feet was in fact the devil himself, and that from time to time he still returns to Loftus Hall, causing the persistent poltergeist activity that is reported there. It is claimed that there have been several exorcisms carried out of Loftus Hall over the years, none of which have apparently ever been very successful. The ghost of a young woman, presumed to be Anne Tottenham, is said to make frequent appearances in the hall, and she is sometimes reportedly seen during one of the regular ghost tours of the house. However, there are one or two minor problems with the version of the story that is told to the visitors. The account of the card game and of Anne's subsequent death are said to have happened in 1766 and 1775, respectively. However, much of the original hall was demolished and rebuilt in a more modern style in the 1870s by the fourth Marquis of Ely. It was further extensively remodelled for a planned visit to the hall by Queen Victoria several years later. So the present-day Loftus Hall bears very little resemblance, either inside or out, to the original hall in which the infamous card game and the fiery exit of the handsome man was said to have taken place over 100 years earlier. The damaged ceiling, which is shown to visitors and cited as proof of the story, didn't actually exist at the time the events were supposed to have taken place. And whoever the handsome young man was, if he existed at all, managed to exit through the ceiling, leaving all of the supporting beams and the floorboards of the floor above intact, damaging only the dilapidated and crumbling plaster ceiling. Notwithstanding these inconvenient discrepancies, Loftus Hall still today boasts it as being the most haunted house in Ireland, with regular appearances in the media that bolster that reputation. Well, take a quick look. This one was from one of the British newspapers. Thomas Beavis made this spine-tingling discovery as he flicked through his camera on a drive home from Loftus Hall. He took the snaps, he said, whilst on a tour with friends, but captured perhaps the spirit of little Anne Tottenham and the spooky face of an old lady. He told metro.co.uk, "I only really looked at the photo while we were driving home. I was actually stunned." I hope you can all see the spectral image of Anne Tottenham. But perhaps we zoom in a little and we can see maybe a resemblance to the young lady in pink. We go in a little further and we can see that perhaps Anne Tottenham is merely a reflection in the glass. Now, as someone who has spent far too long studying this kind of eerie experience, I have learned that, disappointingly, most are nothing more than fantastical stories, sometimes with more than a dash of wishful thinking. But for me, there is something much more interesting about these two locations than just their shared story of the devil playing cards, or even the accounts of their lingering ghosts and malevolent spirits. I'm not referring either to those intrepid guys from Ghost Adventures who investigated both locations during their 2014 Halloween special. And we'll have a little extract of that.
So this here, Zach, is the tapestry room.
They say this is the most haunted house in Ireland. And within that haunted house, they say this is the most haunted room in the most haunted house. Every legend is based on some fact. So I know the legend associated with the Hellfire Club.
In the 18th century, debauchery and human sacrifice were believed to be practiced by a secret society called the Hellfire Club. This devious group of aristocrats met at the top of Mount Pellier Hill, overlooking Dublin. The legend states it was here the devil paid a visit.
These two locations share a very, very similar story. We didn't know that that location had a tie-in to this location.
You know, I think a lot of the Hellfire stuff, the secret society, actually took place here. Then they moved it out so they didn't get a lot of heat happening here with what they were doing.
Do you believe that the Hellfire Club visited this hall?
The Hellfire Club would have indirectly visited this hall because what's not known by many is the same family were involved in the Hellfire Club as are involved here.
And is it just coincidence that a stranger with hooved feet came over there and played cards with them, just as a stranger with hooved feet did here?
There may be something more than just my interest in ghosts. and the paranormal that draws me to both Dublin, the Hellfire Club, and down to Wexford's Loftus Hall. Let's rewind to this man, the founder of the Hellfire Club, and let's complete the caption, as it might just give you a clue. And remember Dionysus, the first Earl, was not only founder of the Hellfire Club, but he also founded the secret sect of Dionysus and was, as I said before, a Grand Master of Irish Freemasonry. I mentioned earlier that according to the legend, meetings of the Hellfire Club used an inverted bell in order to summon the devil to join them at their meetings. Such a bell still exists, and cast into the bronze are classic Dionysian scenes. We'll have a look at them, but let's have a listen to the bell. Even I'm not brave enough to do it 5 times. These are some 3 slides showing some close-ups of the Dionysian or Bacchanalian scenes. We can see here the god Pan. Remember the brass figure from before. And further round the bowl, we can see some of the satyrs and the nymphs. No, just there, the cloven feet as well. And we can see an ass and a nymph dancing and cavorting. The bell seen in the video and in the pictures actually belongs to me and was passed down to me through the family, who said it had been in the family for a very long time. At first I was puzzled and wondered why I'd been given this empty bronze flower bowl that always stood on a shelf by my grandfather's chair, and in which he sometimes kept odd trinkets and items, his pipe and his tobacco, coins. When he gave it to me, he showed me that when the bowl was struck, it rang like a bell. He also mentioned not ringing it 5 times. Now, let's cast your mind back to that skeleton found in Killikey House and the bronze or brass figure found in the grave. The devil or the figure is more likely to represent a satyr or perhaps the god Pan. Pan was the Greek god of nature, fertility, the springtime. He was part of the retinue of Dionysus and inexorably linked to the cult of Dionysus. This particular bronze figure was given to me by an Irish friend who is a folklorist and whose father had worked on the renovations at Killikey House. When they gave it to me, it was with the suggestion that I might be the best person to take charge of this slightly misshapen figure. It's also said that every member of the Hellfire Club had their own small figure of the god, which they carried to remind them of their allegiance to the club. This shows the excavated bronze figure of Pan, together with a small iron figure that was given to me by the same person that gave me the bowl. He said it did belong to his father and his grandfather before him. Now, records show that the Loftus family and the Parsons family were linked by both blood and marriage. They also show that the Tottenham family were also blood relatives of both the Loftus and Parsons families. And of course, there are several tales and legends that suggest that the Hellfire Club met either at Loftus Hall or somewhere close by. So let's start to draw these threads toward a conclusion. Let's just go back to Dionysus one more time. He was associated with his beast was the leopard, and he was often portrayed with a leopard. Here we can see 3 leopard heads that form part of the family coat of arms of the Earls of Ross, carved above the entrance of their family home and seat at Birr Castle. We can also see a leopard's head on my family coat of arms too. Now, all of this... The thing is, I know that they're there. Those thunderclaps are there. Now, it may be just wishful thinking, a bit of good old Irish storytelling. The old, or it may be that the old bronze bowl and the small figures might be my own connection to the Earl of Ross, the Hellfire Club, and the sect of Dionysus. And whether you choose to believe or not, as someone who has spent more than half a century studying the paranormal and things that go bump in the night, I offer you the following closing advice. Just be careful who you play cards with on dark and stormy nights. And as I'll pop my camera back on, I think, hopefully that will work. And that concludes the...
No more thunder and lightning sound effects, Steve?
No, do you know,
promise?
I got caught out by them myself.
Okay. So, folks, let's give Steve a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Steve has stayed up past midnight. He had a very busy day, drove 300 miles or so, it sounds like. It was a big day for his family. Very, just really appreciate you spending some time with us. So if anyone has any questions for Steve, please type them into the Q&A. If you have any comments, please type them into the chat, and we're going to run through them. Ellen says, great talk. MD says, I loved this. Thank you, Steve. Larry says, thanks for sharing. Jay says, thank you. Ralph says, totally cool. Thank you, Steve. So Christopher wants to know, was membership in these clubs intended to be a political or religious statement? I know many of the members were as establishment as it gets, and I assume at least outwardly Christian. Was the express purpose to retreat from the expectations placed on people of such station?
I'll be honest and say the answer, I obviously, I don't know the answer definitively, but I would suggest that the most likely explanation for the meetings of not just the Dublin Hellfire Club, there were others around the UK at that time, was just men being men, rebel rousing, drinking, debauchery, gambling. I don't really consider that there was very much devil worshipping going on in reality. But it was a good story to keep away busy locals from spying and getting sort of being like HOAs, perhaps.
Marcia says, thanks for the great presentation. Wendy says, thank you. Carla says, thank you. Jan says, very informative and interesting, as your talks usually are. Ellen wants to know, were any women allowed in these clubs?
There were women servants, actually, there were. And of course, you can't have debauchery without...
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Tish says, I loved the talk. What books on the club would you recommend? So any books written about these clubs?
There are very few. And to be honest with you, actually researching, there's a couple, if you would have to search on Google for the actual titles. But there have been, there's at least 2 written by notable Irish folklorists. The titles of which escape me, but a simple search on Google. But surprisingly, it's actually the UK Hellfire Club, the one that's north of London, usually gets a great deal of credit or publicity these days.
So Ron Kolick, who has a question, who I want to thank for connecting me with you, Steve. He says, wasn't Ben Franklin a member?
It's possible because the Hellfire Club members, of course, were secretive, and they didn't publish a list of their membership. There are many people who were likely members. The Duke of Wellington was said to be a member of one of the Hellfire Clubs, as were several leading politicians of the time.
Kathy says she loved it. Great sound effects. Ralph says congratulations to your wife on her degree and graduation. JD wants to know, what do you imagine would happen if you rang the bell 5 times, and have you ever been tempted to do so?
I'll be honest, I've rang it 5 times, dozens of times. I should really, it's on a shelf just to one side of me, but it's underneath 3 or 4 other things at the moment, because like my granddad, he used to keep stuff in it. And I'll be honest, I still think it's a flower bowl, but there we are. But yeah, I have rang it 5 times, and I'm still here to tell the tale.
There you go. So, Steve, I think we've gone through all the questions and comments. Do you have any last words for the audience before you go to bed?
I think my last words still resonate across just be careful on those darkened stuff. Stick to Netflix and box sets. Don't play cards.
There you go. Good advice, Steve. So, folks, let's give Steve one last big virtual round of applause. Look for an email from me tomorrow with a link to this recording, as well as information about some other upcoming virtual programs. Next week, we have talks on Edgar Allan Poe, on the history of the Ouija board. We have talks on Massachusetts shipwrecks, as well as New England ghost stories. So lots of great things coming up next week on Zoom. When you exit today's program in a few moments, just please make sure to take the feedback survey. Please take 60 seconds and fill out those 7 questions. It is greatly appreciated. So thank you all so much. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Yeah, thanks again, Steve. Great job.
And thank you all for being here.
There you go. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Ron. We'll see you next October. Okay. Bye-bye.
Right.